You for doing this.
Anytime. It's always my pleasure. Welcome everyone to the 7th annual, is it the 7th annual or 8th annual UFO, Western Connecticut UFO Conference. We have a special evening tonight with author and researcher Linda Zimmermann, who will be talking about the Hudson Valley Sightings 40 years later. And on behalf of the Danbury Library and the Friends of the Danbury Library, I welcome you on this pleasant evening. So I ask all of you just to hold off on your questions until the end of Linda's presentation. You can go ahead and just type your questions in the chat and I will relay them to Linda, and we will try to answer every question in kind. So sit back and relax, and Linda, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you very much and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen here, get this going from the beginning. Okay, look good on your end there. You can see the presentation. Okay, perfect. So when we were talking about this year's conference, Aurelio reminded me we are getting to the 40th anniversary the end of this year. And I was like, wow, that is 40 years is some serious time. But it's important to look back on these sightings because we're losing people, we're losing witnesses. What have we learned in the meantime, if anything? And so I'm going to go over some of the major cases. There's so many. There's thousands of them, but I'm going to whittle it down to some of the major ones and then see if we can draw any conclusions and what this means for the future. So this is a great illustration of a typical night during the 1980s, particularly Route 84 in the Brewster to Danbury area was some of the hottest of the hot spots. Also the Taconic Parkway, but massive craft, very low over the roads. And if you're watching this, you probably know Route 84, not a place you want to stop in the middle of the road and get out of your car. So these had to be remarkable objects to get people to really risk their safety. One of the best witnesses I had the privilege to interview and get to know and get to be friends with was Dennis Sant. And I was just crushed to find out he suddenly passed away a couple of months ago. He actually attended one of our conferences, one of the presentations there. I don't remember which year, at least once. He was one of the best witnesses I've ever interviewed, and I'll talk about his story a little later. But Dennis just typified the witness who had a life-altering experience, who saw something absolutely extraordinary, who had trouble getting people to believe his story, as so many of us have over the years. And it is a huge loss to ufology that Dennis has passed away. But as I said, I'll talk about his case in a little bit. So I kind of want to just dedicate this. Dennis was a one of a kind. When I first met him, he was one of those people that you just felt like he was a lifelong friend after, talking to him for 10 minutes. So I really wanted to just start with this. So let's jump into what have I been doing over the years. Well, I started with one book, In the Night Sky, with an accompanying film about the Hudson Valley UFO sightings. And the ink wasn't dry before people said, well, you have to tell my story too. And I started getting more cases. I started pushing back the sightings to the early 1900s. Then came the third book. I had enough material for a fourth. I said, no, this is getting ridiculous. What was needed was one comprehensive, massive hardcover book. This thing weighs about 4 pounds, 8.5 by 11 hardcover. And I combined all of the 3 books and all of the new material I had collected for the years after the third book. So this, if you want a comprehensive look at the whole history of sightings in this area. And when I say Hudson Valley, particularly in the 1980s, that absolutely included Western Connecticut, as we're going to see. The index listing for Danbury sightings alone is quite substantial in this book. So if you read this book and you don't think the Hudson Valley has been the #1 hotspot in the country, if not the world, in the last 100 years, I have failed in my job. But let's jump into the Great Hudson Valley Wave itself. Oh, excuse me. If you're interested, I do have a podcast called UFO Headquarters, and the majority of the episodes are centered around Hudson Valley cases. In fact, in November, I'm having somebody who used to be an APRO. APRO was kind of a precursor to MUFON investigators. He was an APRO investigator on the ground investigating the wave when it began in 83 and 84. And I can't wait to interview him to see what he has to say. So if you remember the Unsolved Mysteries program with Robert Stack, in 1992, they did a really well done, I thought, recap of some of the highlights of the Hudson Valley Wave cases. Excuse me. So the wave, this is a clip from that show. So the wave began December 31st, 1982. A retired NYPD officer living in Kent went outside that night. He admittedly, excuse me, they were drinking champagne, and they had just bought this new house. He had retired to this house, and he went outside to smash a bottle of champagne against the house, which isn't the greatest idea. And they had kids, and the wife's like, you go out there and clean up that glass, before the little kids. All right. So he's out there and he's like, what am I seeing? Some sort of strange lights. They were red, white, green, just didn't look like normal aircraft lights. And it was moving slowly towards him. And he realized it was in the shape of a massive boomerang, not a typical conventional aircraft configuration. It slowly moved directly overhead, 500 feet altitude. That is crazy low. So if you can see a UFO at 500 feet, you better believe that's going to leave an enormous impression. When it was directly overhead, he said he kind of heard a hum, but it's more like he felt it, some sort of vibration in his chest. And he yells for his wife, grab the video camera and come out here. We need to film this. And he did take some footage. You can see some of the lights, but the quality in 83, at the end of 82, was not high definition by any stretch. So it didn't come out very well. But the boomerang had a lot of colored lights. The colored lights all went out. 3 bright white lights came on in the shape of a triangle. They went out. The colored lights came back on. It was just doing things conventional craft do not do. and it eventually just slowly moved off towards Route 84. So probably within minutes later, Ed Hansen was driving on I-84, and there were a number of cars pulled over, and he saw a massive boomerang. I mean, this thing was huge. He said it was probably about 900 feet wide. That's 3 football fields, only 300 feet in the air. It just consumed the entire sky. I remember one of my favorite quotes was a witness in the Danbury area who saw one of these low, massive craft, and she described it as the entire sky was metal and lights. And that's frightening when it's a few hundred feet above your head. This craft was also making tight circles over the road. And again, conventional aircraft cannot make tight circles like that. They have to bank and go around. And you would hear the engine sound, and he heard nothing. And it was beaming down a white light as if it was scanning or checking out people. And this is an important key. I kind of get goosebumps thinking of this. During this Hudson Valley wave, people would think about something and the craft would react. I heard this over and over again. He thought, I wish it would get closer so I could get a better look at it. Well, when it comes to UFOs, be careful what you wish for, because immediately this craft starts coming towards him. The beam of light is headed straight for his car, and he realized this was a big mistake. He is now terrified. You can imagine this grown man in his car. He's blowing the horn, screaming, get away, get away. I changed my mind. Don't come anywhere near. He just loses it. And at this point, he said, there were thoughts that weren't my own in my head. And I heard a voice saying, don't be afraid. And this is another thing we hear all the time, somehow telepathically, don't be afraid. We're not going to hurt you. That's not always the truth, I have to say. But finally, at the last second, the beam of light goes out and the craft turns away and goes away. He hits the accelerator. He speeds home. He doesn't tell anyone, not even his wife, for weeks. And it wasn't until newspaper articles were coming out about the thousands of people who witnessed it that he came forward and spoke. And that's another important key. There is power, there is empowerment in people coming out and speaking, because you give courage to the next witness to say, well, if he or she was able to stand up and tell their story, then I can too, and the next person and the next person. And so I hope if anyone out there has stories, encounters, you can be anonymous, but, you know, try to find the courage to stand up and tell your story, because there's a lot of other people out there who feel alone and can't talk about it. So all of these people on Route 84 this night are pulled over out of their cars watching this. A lot of people all around in the area. You can imagine how many people in this Route 84 Kent area and beyond saw the craft that night. It was a huge, huge event. And that was day one. And there were 6 more years of the Hudson Valley wave. And not to demean or diminish the importance of the Phoenix Lights, which just about everybody has heard of. The Phoenix Lights was astonishing, an enormous amount of witnesses. It was one day. That was a typical day of the week in the Hudson Valley for 6 years. It's just incredible. So just these these couple of little cases from the first night kind of established the characteristics of the 6 years to follow. Triangular shaped craft, V-shaped craft. Haven't talked about it yet, but a lot of circular, the classic flying saucer. But it was really the age of the boomerang, the V, and the triangle. They were massive. I wish I had $1 for every witness who described it as the size of a football field. So huge, silent, or a slightest hum or vibration. Very, very low altitude, often treetop level. And again, you have something the size of a football field or larger at treetop level, you are never going to forget that is going to change you in some way. They were almost always brightly lit. They wanted to be seen. That's, people said they were stealth projects, black ops, secret military craft. Do you really light up a secret military craft like a Christmas tree and park it over Route 84 or some other major highway? That just doesn't make any sense. These craft were wanting to be seen. They had the capability to hover completely still in high winds and all kinds of weather, and then move rapidly. And I mean miles. And there's a case I'm going to talk about in Danbury, actually, in a little bit, moved 2 or 3 miles in several seconds. So again, some people said, oh, they were stealth blimps. Well, fine. Blimps can hover. Can they move 3 miles in 4 seconds? I don't think so. The other key to this wave, telepathic communication. I heard it over and over again during the encounter, and then people seem to have an enhanced or newfound sixth sense directly afterwards. Something happens, and I'm not just talking about, oh, I saw some distant lights 20 miles away. I'm talking about something was directly over you, or you had missing time, something intense and close. It does something to your sixth sense. It just does. I don't know how. I don't pretend to know how, but the evidence proves that it does. And on any given night, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses every night. So you do the math. How many? A couple times a month, at least, sometimes more, hundreds or thousands of witnesses over the course of 6 years. This is a stunning wave of UFO activity that every ufologist should have at the top of their list of remarkable cases. So the first one was December 31st, 1982. And just 2 months later, in February 26, 1983, a woman, 38-year-old woman by the name of Monique O'Driscoll. She lived in Carmel. She and her daughter, Monique, were visiting her mother in Kent, again, the Kent area. And they're driving home, and her daughter sees these really bright lights in the woods. She said, oh, they must have built a new house. And they're looking, and they're getting closer, and they realize that is no house. Their car radio goes to static so badly they had to turn it off. This is another key feature of UFO encounters: EM interference, cars stalling, radios going static. And the daughter says it looks like it's heading towards White Pond. So later, if you're not familiar with these areas, I'm mentioning the locations because a lot of people, including myself, like to go to the actual sites of these sightings. So you should be able to find White Pond. And the daughter is yelling, "You better not follow it." But Monique has one mission. She is following this craft. And it's directly over White Pond. This is a fabulous illustration. The lights are brightly lit, multicolored, reflecting off the ice. Monique gets out. She used terms like euphoric and mesmerized. She cannot get enough of standing there watching this craft. Her daughter, not so much. She's screaming at her mother to get back in the car. Finally, the craft moves off, but Monique is not done. She's following it again. And of course, her daughter is, "Oh, please don't, no, she's following it." And she gets out again, and the same thing happens. She just stands there transfixed. They were on Farmers Mills Road, Gypsy Trail Road were two of the roads where they followed it. Again, if you'd like to track the path of this UFO, as they're stopped and she's out again looking at it, another car stops with four young men. And Monique's like, "Have you seen it? We've been following it for quite a while." Again, this is what people did. They jumped in their car if they weren't already, and they did everything they could do to follow it, to look at it for every last second they could absorb. And then another car pulls over, and it's a friend of hers, Rita Rivera. And they're both standing there looking at it. It starts to move away, and eventually they do lose sight of it. But Monique described it as 200 to 300 feet in length. And this we heard over and over again. The underside was like the underside of a bridge with these crisscross beams and tubular things. We think of these classic smooth flying saucers. These craft in the 80s, they said they actually physically saw girders and tubes and pipes. It sounded like a homemade project, except it was the size of a football field and could do things none of our craft could do. And this entire sighting, which lasted many, many minutes, multiple eyewitnesses, absolutely no sound the entire time. Now, you probably have all seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Richard Dreyfuss becomes obsessed and starts making the Devil's Tower with his potatoes. And then he's making it with clay. And then he's making it with dirt. And people are drawing it over. Monique had that obsession. This is one of her sketches. She started painting it in color. And I don't know how many versions she just kept painting and sketching it over and over again. She just kept saying, "I have to get it right. I have to get it right." It was this deep compulsion to keep reproducing the craft she saw. Many people called the Kent police, the Carmel police, and also the Danbury police, because that night there were sightings in Danbury. One of the documented one was a teacher by the name of Herbert Proudfoot. He and two of his friends, who happened to be air traffic controllers, who are great to have when you're viewing unidentified aerial phenomenon, they were getting off an exit on Route 84 in Danbury, and they saw this incredibly huge boomerang shaped craft. They and other people stopped, got out, absolutely no sound, passed over them, no more than 1,000 feet, which again is very low. And At first, they didn't want to talk about it at all. When the craft left, they made an agreement. Nobody talks. Nobody will believe us. You know, air traffic controllers, it wouldn't have been good for their career to start talking about the UFOs they were seeing. But again, once more and more people were coming out talking about it, they said, okay, we feel comfortable now to tell our stories. Mr. Proudfoot said, use my name, I don't care. The two air traffic controllers told their stories, but said they needed to be anonymous. So there was a group of investigators who very early on were studying these cases, getting eyewitness accounts, which is great to do that within days of a sighting. So the information is fresh in their witnesses' minds. And the investigators went to the Danbury police and said, could you please give us information about the sightings of February 26th? And they were told, stable people do not report UFOs. So not a good start. They were not sympathetic, to say the least. However, there's that phrase, what is that? The worm turns, or what goes around comes around. So these same police officers who were ridiculing and demeaning witnesses, they were about to change their minds the night of July 12th, 1984. And they were going to change their minds in a very big way. 12 Danbury police officers witnessed a large oval. And this was the case where the oval, brightly lit, was hovering, sometimes directly over them. And this was the case where one police officer said this craft moved 2 or 3 miles in just several seconds. And so you have a dozen police officers. Also in the town of Bethel nearby, a police officer saw this craft, and you know those spotlights they have on their car? He shined the spotlight up at this craft, and instantly the craft beamed a blinding light back down on him. So I don't know if that was a friendly acknowledgement or that was a, stop shining a light on us type of response. So the police chief, Nelson Machado, I think you pronounce that. I don't know if anybody out there knew the police chief then. He was on a boat in Candlewood Lake fishing that night with his nephew, brother-in-law, and a retired police officer. And the nephew very excitedly says, "What is that?" And they turn around and look, and it's a massive dark gray, circular, slightly oval craft, very much lit up. They're not happy about this. They're in a cove called, if you're familiar with Candlewood Lake, the old Neversink Cove. They're not happy. It's bad enough you're on land and there's a craft over you. But when you're in the water, I think there's a particular feeling of being vulnerable. So they shut out all the boat lights. Guess what the UFO does immediately? The UFO in response shuts off all its lights. So this is conscious interaction. People who would say these were drones, radio controlled something. No, these craft reacted. Just like with the Bethel police officer shining a bright light on them. So they turn their lights back on and start flicking them back on and off. And the craft puts its lights back on and starts running through different levels of intensity of lights. So there was a very primitive communication. I see you, you see us, we're acknowledging you, you're acknowledging us, which could be exciting, and it can also be terrifying. The craft finally moved away, and it is estimated on that night alone of July 12th, 1984, 5,000 local residents saw those craft throughout the Danbury area and other parts of Western Connecticut and spilling over into New York there. That is a lot of witnesses. And again, that is one night out of 6 years of sightings. And the same police department who was saying stable people don't report UFOs, the police chief himself stated, "I saw something that I still can't explain, and I don't care what anybody says." Well, what do you know? So be careful how you ridicule and run down people in an extraordinary event, because once you witness it, you may have to eat a little humble pie there. All right, another hot spot was the Indian Point nuclear reactor, which is in Buchanan, New York, that's right on the Hudson River. It was just recently, in the last year or two, decommissioned, and I think the plans are to clean it up and put a housing project there. I think I would look for real estate elsewhere than on a former nuclear site. There were many, many sightings over Indian Point going back to 1969. But during that Hudson Valley wave of the 80s, a banner day was July 24th, 1984. A craft described as being as long as 900 feet, that is 3 football fields in length, was directly over the exhaust tower of reactor number 3. Probably not coincidentally, reactor number 3 was the only functional reactor at that time. During the time this craft was over the reactor, all of the security systems shut down, just about all the monitoring systems, just about everything shut down. Guards were issued shotguns. They went out and were standing under this thing and were awaiting for the order to fire on it. It's sketchy as to whether they did or not, but I think cooler heads prevailed, and they realized we're standing next to a nuclear reactor with a 900-foot unidentified craft. Maybe we shouldn't fire shotguns at it. Probably wouldn't have been done any damage anyway, but probably not the time to show hostility. There was another massive sighting in 1985. Again, a large craft looking something like this, hovering again directly over the nuclear reactor. And I probably shouldn't have to say this is restricted airspace. You can't get much more restricted than over a nuclear reactor. And some people were saying, oh, it was small planes flying in formation, which I'll get to in a little bit. But yeah, small planes can't hover, and they would have been out of their minds to hover over a nuclear reactor, because you would probably lose your license and your freedom and everything else. I interviewed a lot of people who grew up in this area and saw UFOs, I was told, all the time. One of my favorite witnesses said that, yeah, when we were growing up and we were bored, we'd say, let's go down to Indian Point and watch the UFOs. I was like, wait, what? It happened that often? She goes, yeah, it was the thing to do. The thing to do. That's how many sightings were over the reactor. And of course, throughout history, nuclear weapons facilities, reactors, many UFOs have been witnessed over nuclear sites or nuclear weapons locations. Okay. Back in 2016, when we were having our conference, our Western Connecticut UFO conference, there was some publicity in the local paper, the News Times. And I was monitoring some of what people were saying. And this is a lot of text, but what this woman whose username was Sasha Tree was saying, I hate to burst bubbles, but my father and his friends all owned ultralights and absolutely delighted in pulling off UFO hoaxes. And according to her, this group of ultralights was responsible for all of the UFO sightings during the 80s. Which was, of course, was against, as she's even saying, that it was completely against the law because you're not supposed to fly an ultralight late at night, in the dark, and of course not over a nuclear reactor. And she's, her contention, everything that was seen in those years was just a bunch of good old guys having fun pulling pranks. So I kept hearing this time and time again. When I first started my research, people would say, why are you bothering looking into that? It was the ultralights, or it was a group of Cessnas. And yes, there were pilots who were flying in formation thinking it was funny. But again, I wish I had $1 for the hundreds of people I witnessed who'd say, we saw the massive silent craft, and many of them would say, and we saw the idiots in those small planes trying to pretend to be UFOs, but they hardly fooled anyone because they're noisy, they couldn't stay in formation. And this is me with a thumbs up. I'm smiling, putting on a good front, thinking, oh my God, I'm about to die. What am I doing? Am I crazy? But for me to discount the theory of ultralights, I needed to experience ultralights. So this was part of my research. You can see it didn't give me a really good feeling. If you can see on the top of the little fabric wing there, it says experimental, because that's how you want to spend your Saturday afternoon, strapping yourself into a little experimental tube plane, plane made of tubes with essentially a giant weed whacker lawnmower engine in it. But when we got up in the air, oh my God, it was beautiful. It's such a sense of freedom. But you can see I have a microphone in front of my mouth there, because to try to be heard, the pilot and the passenger back and forth, you have to scream at the top of your lungs because these planes are deafening. You can hear them coming from a long distance. So if there had been a formation of 6 or 7 ultralights flying at treetop level, they would have sounded like a flock of lawnmowers. They could not ever be mistaken for silent, hovering craft. But it produced enough doubt in some people's minds that they discounted the entire 6 years of sightings because of these hoaxing pilots. I just recently, not too long ago, communicated with one of the daughters of one of the pilots. Now, I have to say, in 40 years, not a single pilot had the guts to come forward. And when they were caught, some of them made some comments, but come forward and say, well, here's my flight logs. These are the nights we flew. These are the nights we didn't fly. This is why we did it. I said, could you please, anonymously tell me what you know about the pilots who were doing this? Why did they do it? How often did they do it? And she very cryptically responded, so much to say, so much to not say. And that got my spidey senses tingling. Well, because a lot of rumors were flying that these pilots weren't just risking their licenses for fun. Some government agency was paying them. I know this sounds conspiratorial, but they were getting paid to create this disinformation campaign to discredit any of the legitimate sightings and witnesses. And just last week, I was emailing back and forth with someone who was an investigator during that time. And he said they had heard the same thing, that these pilots were getting paid by some unknown government agency. So I have to say they did a really great job, because 40 years later, I can be going to speak in California or Arizona or somewhere else, and someone inevitably will come up to me that, well, don't you know every Hudson Valley UFO sighting was a result of the hoaxing pilots? And after I tear out my hair and try to explain to them, no, that wasn't the case, it still persists. So they were very good at creating the seeds of doubt, and still to this day. So we will be haunted with this forever. I've tried to contact, I know the names of a lot of these pilots. No one has gotten back to me. A lot of them have passed away. So if any of you out there were the pilots or knew them, have the guts to come. Why aren't you coming clean 40 years later? Just tell us what you know. So enough of them. So here's a young Dennis Sant on the left with his sharing a pipe with none other than Dr. J. Allen Hynek. There were so many sightings in the early part of 83 that Hynek came out from Chicago to find out what the heck was going on. And he was very, very impressed. He said, physicians and teachers and military and law enforcement, highly educated people. He said something real and legitimate and important was happening. Now, Dennis, he went to see Dennis because of Dennis's remarkable sighting on March 17th, 1983. Here I am 30 years later when I went to see Dennis. He was kind enough to be interviewed for the book and the film we did. And he told his story where lived in Brewster, right under an overpass for Route 84. He's coming home with his kids. He sees all these cars stopped up on Route 84. Again, not a safe thing to do. Stop your car in the middle of 84 and get out. And then he sees this enormous craft, kind of L-shaped, boomerang shaped. And he's standing there in his yard, back here. Here we are. I call this the Sound of Music shot. You're looking down on us. But off to the left, that was a pond back in 83. And he's standing there thinking, I wish I could get a closer look at this craft. And do I need to tell you what happened? Immediately, the craft started moving toward him, was hovering over him at treetop level. You can see the willow trees here probably have grown a lot over the decades. So this craft is very, very low. It's bright lights reflecting in the water. He said it was like, a college football game stadium, so brightly lit up. And it's coming closer and lower. And that feeling, boy, I wish I could get a better look, started to turn to fear. What if it lands in my yard? What if it takes me? And as soon as he started having this fear, the craft started moving away. And he really regretted having that fear, but you can't blame them. You don't know what this is. It's a huge unbelievably bizarre looking craft that is silently hovering over you with all of these bright lights. His children saw it, neighbors saw it, all of the people pulled off on Route 84 saw it. So the 17th of March 1983 was a huge night of sightings. Dennis told me it was so low that if he had had a softball, a baseball, he could have hit it. I interviewed another person in another part of Brewster, and he was a tennis player, and he said, if I had a tennis ball, it was so low, I could have hit it. So that gives you an idea. And clearly, if something is so low, you can hit it with a ball, you would be able to identify if it was small planes or not. I mean, not even a question. Well, one whole week later, these three ladies, whom I refer to as the three teachers because they were three teachers, they had a similar sighting on the Taconic Parkway, and they had an excellent story and recounting it. They're driving home on the Taconic. All these cars are pulled over. They get out of their cars, and this object is hovering silently over them for 20 solid minutes. When a craft like that can make an impression in 3 seconds, I can't imagine 20 minutes. Many sightings that night. There was a picture from that night. A high school boy was coming out of photography club, and he took this photo here on the left. It's kind of grainy because it was in the newspaper, but you can see it's a triangular shaped craft, all brightly lit up. And if you look carefully, there's a single beam of light that is illuminating the ground. So again, clearly not a formation of small planes. This was a solid craft beaming a light down. So we do fortunately have a picture of it from that night. This is Maureen Davis getting mic'd up for the film. And that is Felix standing there, putting the mic on her. The production company that made the film was called Big Guy Media. And I think you can see why it was called that. She had an encounter in September of 1985 in Yorktown Heights. She went to the bus stop to pick up her husband, and she looks up, and there is a craft, triangular craft, which is just huge. And I said, was it the size of a football field? She said, no, it was the size of a football stadium. So take a second to absorb that. And this was also the first time I had heard this. She could see up into the craft because there was a circular opening. She saw levels like balconies inside of it. And at one point, a red ball of light, which again, we hear all the time in relation to these craft, comes from behind, goes up into the opening disappears, and this thing the size of a football stadium just goes and takes off and disappears. This is one of my favorite cases for actually seeing up inside of the craft. I don't want to neglect the flying saucer sightings, the discs. Inevitably, when I'm in a crowd of people and giving a talk and I put this up, I hear 2 or 3 people go, oh, that's what I saw. So this has been something that has been seen for decades in this area in particular. And in the summer of 84, this delightful woman, Gloria LaPala, who lived on the north end of Lake Oscawana. If you see that little opening behind the bird feeders there, in summer of 84, she and her parents saw this craft. She did this great illustration of it. It was moving so slowly, she could walk underneath it. And if you will notice, this was a daytime sighting. This, one of the rare ones. This wasn't strange lights in the sky. They saw the craft. She calls the police, and rather than them dismissing her, she asks, what is going over Lake Oscawana? And the police, who had seen it themselves, just simply said, I'll be damned if we know, lady. So finally, an honest response. Um, I included this sketch on top of it because it looks almost identical, the same shape, the squarish windows, and the alternating lights. This was a craft that was seen by many, many people in Cornwall, New York in 1992. So 8 years apart, but practically identical craft. This was a sketch done for me by a police officer, also in the Lake Oscawana area in the 1980s. So even though I emphasized triangles, boomerangs, V-shaped craft, there were enormous amount of circular craft like this that were seen. This is one of the best pictures. This was taken by a police officer. I believe it was a Connecticut state trooper, May 26th, 1987, in Waterbury, Connecticut. That is not a formation of small planes. That is lights around the rim of a circular object. This is a great photo. All right, and I want to end up with the abduction phenomena, something we can't ignore. I was stunned at how many people during the 1980s did not just see a low silent craft. They had missing time. They had all the classic abduction symptoms and experiences. And in fact, one of the first people I interviewed for my project was this man who didn't want his identity to be known. Gary, he had started having abduction experiences in the 50s. They really reached a peak in the 1980s. Many, many experiences. And at the time I was interviewing him, his elderly mother was still alive. And I said, don't be offended, but can I interview your mother? Because, you want to see, was he very imaginative? Did he make up stories? So, here he is describing a craft he saw one night, an egg-shaped craft. And he had 2 hours of missing time that night. Very typical. His mother starts saying, oh yes, Gary would tell me these stories and this and that. And she started saying, well, they look like this, they look like that. And it didn't sound like secondhand information she was telling me. I said, well, wait a minute. Did you have experiences of your own? Oh yes, back beginning in the 1930s. Both she and the man she ended up marrying, who lived in the same apartment building, were having missing time and abduction experiences from the 30s through the rest of their lives. Gary, their son, had experiences. His kids had experiences, and now the grandkids. So whatever this phenomenon is, it is definitely targeting generations of family members, which, as we were saying earlier, doesn't help me go to sleep at night when you think of this. So there was an enormous, I could do an entire presentation on encounters and abductions from the 1980s, but it was at a fever pitch during that time. So we're 40 years later. So what can we conclude, or what does this mean? Well, in those 40 years, we can honestly say there has never been another wave as intense or as long and with so many witnesses as those 6 or so years in the 1980s in New York and Western Connecticut. There's just never been anything else like it. More importantly, there has never been a suitable explanation. No military craft has ever been revealed. Everybody's saying, again, secret military craft. Well, 40 years later, why have we never heard anything about it? Why has that technology not been brought into the mainstream? No prototypes, no blueprints, and just plain and simple, where do you store a craft the size of a football stadium in the tri-state area? We're not in the middle of Area 51. We're in the middle of one of the most populated areas in the country. It's hard to hide craft the size of stadiums. Some people enjoyed their experiences, but many, many witnesses are still traumatized. These are life-changing events. And for 40 years, some people have been afraid to go outside by themselves. They still have nightmares about it. These were just incredible experiences. And last and certainly not least, we are losing witnesses from that time period every day. So if you know somebody, particularly if they're elderly, that has a story that should be documented, please write it down, have them contact me if you had a story, because once these witnesses are gone, they're gone, and their stories are lost if somebody doesn't film them, write them down, something. So if you want to get in touch with me, my email is lindazim@optonline.net. Again, I have the podcast UFO headquarters. You can go to just about any podcast platform and catch up on many, many episodes. And I also have a Facebook page called Hudson Valley UFOs. You can get in touch with me through there. So that is in a very tight, small nutshell, 6 years of absolutely extraordinary, mind-blowing experiences that have been reproduced in small, isolated encounters, but nothing like we experienced in the Hudson Valley in the 80s. So, Aurelio, back to you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you so much. We're going to open up the chat now for questions that I can relate to Linda. So take your time and think about some questions you may want to ask her. So we're going to just go through right now. There was someone who was friends with Dennis Sands, and it's so sad to hear him about his passing. I know that was all pretty sudden of him, passing away. And we did see him. He did attend the Michael Schratt presentation when he first came to the library. So that was kind of an honor. That it was also the evening of him and his wife's wedding anniversary. So they were going out to celebrate, but they wanted to stop by the Danbury Library and check out Michael's presentation. And that was kind of like our sort of like nod that you guys are legit. So we have a question here. Were the abduction experiences just in the Hudson Valley?
No, they were throughout the area. Upstate New York, New Jersey, of course, Connecticut, quite a few in Connecticut. And I'm just talking about this time period, but they went back many decades. So they were very concentrated in the 80s, but I have some amazing stories from the 70s and earlier. And so I'm talking about a little slice of that, but clearly it was a phenomenon going on for generations. And Aurelio, you and I were talking beforehand, just in the last several weeks, suddenly there has been a frightening spike in abductions and missing time episodes. And if you're not familiar with that, you're driving down the road, you see a craft, and suddenly an hour and a half has gone by and you have no idea, what happened, or something like that. So for some reason, we will see in the future, but abductions are on the rise again.
Yeah, it's pretty scary to hear about that. And that was something that we did speak about with Peter Robbins on Sunday. If there was any sort of uptick, but now there's confirmation. So, if you have any stories about that or past stories, please contact Linda, or if you know anyone who has had an experience in the past, 3-4 decades in this area, please contact Linda. We want to get it down in her book. And by the way, what's the name of your new book again?
It is Hudson Valley UFOs, the best evidence.
Is it out now?
Yes, yes, you can order it. It's on Amazon. Again, it's 8.5 by 11, almost 500 pages. I did Coast to Coast a couple of months ago, and George Norrie had the book, and he said, if you drop this out a building window, you could kill somebody. What a ringing endorsement. Maybe
That's
I should
awesome.
put a warning label on my book. Do not drop on somebody's head, could be dangerous. But it just goes to show how many cases over how many generations there are to fill a book of this enormous size.
Yeah, that's great. I'll be sure to order one myself. And please, if you can, folks, you can go to your website as well to order it.
Best to go to Amazon.
Best to go to Amazon. So go to Amazon, folks. Check it out. We don't have it here at the library yet, but I will make sure that we'll try to get a copy or two. Linda, have you ever seen a UFO yourself?
1988 July, a friend and I were driving through Washingtonville, New York, and I was driving. We had the windows down, beautiful summer night, and my friend says, "What is that?" And we were both scientists at the time, working in lab, so fairly rational people, and look over, and we were driving along this big field, and very low, an enormous black V with huge round lights, one in the front and a couple along the wings, or whatever you call it, the V-shaped part, absolutely silently gliding. I'd never seen a craft move like that. I get the goosebumps again when I think of it. Tried to follow it, but it went over some trees, and we were unable to follow it. But I had some familiarity with small planes. I took the ground course to get my pilot's license, and these were not small planes. These were not any sort of craft I had ever seen.
In relation to some of the past sightings where people communicated, I guess, with the beings, with the beings telling them telepathically, don't be afraid, or any other messages alleged other than don't be afraid?
Sometimes people were warned about health problems, which seems rather benevolent, that they had something wrong with them, they needed to get checked out. Not so much in the Hudson Valley, but there were a lot of cases where people were warned about, you people have to stop using nuclear weapons, you're going to destroy yourselves, you have to stop polluting. So there always seemed to be kind of little lessons that were trying to be given, but the predominant one was don't be afraid, we're not going to hurt you. And then unfortunately, a lot of them were proceeded to be hurt and in pain. But that was the main thing.
And when you refer to Kent, that was Kent, New York, not Kent, Connecticut.
Right. Excuse me. Yes. Kent, New York.
Is there, have you documented if there's any sort of physical changes to the individuals after any of these encounters?
Certainly physical marks. I've seen Gary has a triangle of like scoop marks in the back of his neck. People would have scars that they hadn't had the day before, healed scars or burn marks. So certainly a lot of nosebleeds. So certainly there were physical repercussions. Some people became very sensitive to bright lights and sounds and headaches, and a lot of unpleasant side effects, should we say, and some still carry the scars to this day.
Were the sightings just, just in general, just at night, were the majority of these sightings?
I'd say 99% were at night. There was the Gloria's sighting of the circular craft in the day. Somebody in northern New Jersey saw a boomerang in broad daylight. That was very, very rare. There were several sightings, a good amount in twilight where it's not bright sunlight, but so, on a summer's night where it's still light enough to be able to see things in the sky. So there were a good amount of sightings where there was still enough light to see the outline of the craft and the detail in the surface of the craft.
Were there any sort of reports of military jets intercepting these objects?
Military helicopters for sure, particularly with one of the Indian Point sightings. Black military helicopters were coming after this thing. It took off. They couldn't keep up with it. But yes, there were several accounts where somehow either the military was alerted to it by radar contacts or somebody called them, but numerous cases of military helicopters in particular trying to chase these things, follow these things. There was a famous case with quarterback Aaron Rodgers in Cornwall, New York in the 90s, I believe it, or early 2000s, where he and his buddies saw some strange craft fly overhead and fighter jets were hot on its heels, trying to intercept it. So yeah, there is a long history of military aircraft. So when they say, we don't know what you're talking about, they're lying.
Yeah, it's pretty much been documented that the, especially with the Tic Tac UFO encounters and everything, regarding that, release of that footage of the pilots, and they have hot spots, and the military, the Navy, they know where these hotspots are, and they are in observation of them. And it's not just one, it's multiple, objects flying in formation for hours, hovering and then going into the stratosphere or going underwater and then hovering. And it's crazy just to hear those reports from the top gun pilots of our military.
Right. And if you don't think they're extraordinary witnesses, you don't understand what goes into their training.
Yeah, exactly. A question, did anybody sort of describe a feeling of change in air pressure around them during these sightings?
Yes, that's a good question because it's rare, but there was a remarkable case, a couple of cases where people felt such a air pressure down, they were pushed down to the ground. Hasn't happened very often, but it's not a feeling of less air pressure, it's a feeling of more pressure, to the point sometimes when they can't even stand up.
Was it like some sort of like negative feeling, negative noise, or like being in a sort of a silent sort of like environment, like in a vacuum?
There, a lot of these things are accompanied by everything going silent. I think Tom Reed talks about that during his encounter. Yeah, where all the crickets, all the animals, all the background noise ceases, and you feel this altered atmosphere, I think is the best way to put it, which can include, pressure, tingling, like a static tingling, lightheadedness, quite a lot of things can occur.
Okay. Do you have any recommended readings or websites regarding the sightings here, besides your book, of course, and everything? Do you have any other ones besides your the books that you've written, or say, of course, Night Siege?
Night Siege, if you're just interested in that wave, they did a remarkable work of interviewing witnesses within days. So clearly that, mine's the most, I have to say, the most comprehensive for the whole span of sightings over the generations. Vinnie Police has a book, just on Pine Bush phenomena. And then there was Ellen Crystal's book, also about Pine Bush. Because one thing I should point out is, when the late 80s, when the Hudson Valley wave was waning, activity really picked up in Pine Bush, New York. And, there are those books just devoted to that. And for those who don't know, and I don't know if you know, Aurelio, that Pine Bush now has a UFO and paranormal museum.
Oh, wow.
And I worked very closely with the director, Lance, on getting the best cases represented in there. And they have models of the craft and displays. And it's I think like an hour and a half guided tour. You can walk through on your own, but take the guided tour and you'll get a really good sense of what's been going on in the Hudson Valley, all of its strangeness, for all these years.
Did you speak to any of the witnesses who had worked at Indian Point? And if you have, what did you learn?
One gentleman who wanted to remain anonymous was part of the 85 sighting, and he's working that night, and somebody calls him up and says, "They're back." And he's like, "Who's back?" He's like, "The UFOs." So he had heard about the 84 sighting, but co-workers talking, he's thinking, they're a little crazy, or they're pulling my leg. So he runs out and he said there was this absolutely enormous craft. And the way he described it, he said, those huge metal canoes that, kind of groan and flex when you're picking them up. He said that's what there was no sound of engines, but he said he heard it like groaning and flexing, which is, I don't know what that means, but that's startling. Was the structure pliable? Was the sound from something else? But again, it was directly over the reactor, and they're like, well, what do we do? Do we shoot at it? What do we do? And they realize there's not a whole lot we can do. So yes, I interviewed him personally, and had secondhand accounts, but he was great to interview because he was there and saw it.
Were there any witnesses in seeing any beings from these craft in the air or on the ground? Any sort of like eyewitness accounts of like seeing some sort of like, beings?
Yes, predominantly the gray types, some who defied description. Uh, Probably my favorite was two girls were going from Cold Spring, New York to White Plains to go shopping. The last thing on their mind is UFOs. They're talking about all the things they want to buy, and they're driving along this dark road, and there's somebody standing in the road. They're like, what is this? And they're getting closer and closer, and it's probably I'd say about 5 or 6 foot tall, gray, wrinkly skin, no clothing, the enormous eyes. That the thing doesn't move, and they drive along within 2 feet of this being. And the way she described, she goes, those eyes, it was just these huge eyes, looking into these black pools of who knows what. And they pass it and they turn around to look, and the thing is gone. And they didn't know about UFOs and aliens, so they called it the Elephant Man. I guess the Elephant Man, the gray, wrinkly skin, that's the only thing they could equate it to. And it was years later when one of them saw a book on grays and things, that's what we saw. But to come within 2 feet of one standing in a road, that's pretty dramatic.
I've never heard that. That's crazy. That's pretty startling to see. And this was during the time period, and there was no any sort of craft sightings on that particular night or in that area.
They didn't see a craft. They didn't remember exactly what night it was, so I couldn't correlate it to other sightings. But I think they gave me just a general, this time of year type thing. But yeah, and there were many other people who saw different beings. But that other than getting abducted and they're in your face, that was the closest one I've come across.
Were there any eyewitnesses of seeing any sort of symbols on the craft, kind of like what happened at Bentwaters in England?
Yes. Mostly geometric type symbols, not too often. But more than the symbols, people were seeing those girders and cross pieces and things like that. But yeah, not so much as the Bentwaters one.
Do you think that we may be near some sort of government disclosure or revelation of maybe this incident, or just in general, with everything? Or what maybe I should bring up, since this is the first in this year's conference, Peter Robbins actually said that we probably will never know. They'll just slowly accumulate,
Right.
give us a little bit here, give us a little bit there, and because I'm feeling, from what I'm hearing for the last couple of days, is, the government will never tell us because they are powerless, with this technology and these beings. They don't know what's going on or anything like that. And to say, oh yeah, they're acknowledge that these things are off-world entities and we have no defense against them, kind of gives the government, well, we're not in control.
Yeah, we're not the superpower we'd like to
We are
project.
completely defenseless against any sort of against these beings, and that would cause chaos and anarchy and all that sort of doom and gloom sort of stuff. So
Well, just a couple of weeks ago, the government did put out a statement where they said they were going to be studying these unidentified aerial phenomenon. And they have now added undersea phenomenon, USOs, undersea phenomenon. And they had one line in there that said objects that were not man-made.
oh I think they
You-
slipped that in there just to be like, oh, by the way.
You can look that up. So, okay, if they're not man-made, they're what? Who made them? So you can look that up just a few weeks ago. So that is a tiny little disclosure bombshell.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's probably what's happening is they're just giving us little nuggets here and there, and we as rational human beings can make up our own conclusions.
Right.
The evidence that we can see, and unfortunately we can't hold on to this stuff, but sooner I think than later we'll come to grips, maybe within, the next 10, 20 years, we'll have a better grasp on things than say the last 20, 30 years. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to say thank you so much, Linda. I'm going to, it's already been like an hour and a half, and I just want to say thanks so much again for always coming to the conference and being one of the first, and always being a fabulous and engaging presenter. And on behalf of the Danbury Library, you're always welcome to come and be a part of our UFO conference. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening, and just be sure to sign up if you haven't registered for Saturday. We will have Mark D'Antonio, who is the chief photo and video analyst for MUFON, Paul Benino, Tom Reed, and Michael Schratt. The first three will be hybrid. So if you want to come to the library and sit down and watch it on the big screen in our Maker Lab, please do so. Mark so far has committed to actually being here in person, so we may actually be graced with his presence, unless something else happens or anything like that. But the entire presentations will be on Zoom. So this link that you used to sign in for this evening, you can use the same one for Saturday. So again, on behalf of the Danbury Library, my name is Aurelio Muraca. I thank you, and thank you for being part of the Western Connecticut UFO Conference. Have a great night.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks.